Good morning, everybody. I'm Amber Clifford Napoleon. I'm the director of the McClure Archives and University Museum at the University of Central Missouri. We're going to give it just a couple of minutes and let the rest of the attendees finish filtering into the room, and then we'll get started. So just a couple more minutes.
Amber, are you going to monitor the chat? Or
I am.
Great. You'll just feed me any questions that come in?
Yep, I'll feed you. Yeah, and I'll ask everybody, since everybody's in the room now, let me ask everyone to please try to hold your questions till the end, because we're going to have a Q&A section at the end, rather than interrupting Beth with questions as we go. I think that would be a better plan. And if you haven't already, please put your Zoom on speaker view and make sure that you are muted, so that we can see the speaker clearly and not get interrupted by the sound of your office or your cell phone or whatever may be the case. Okay, are we ready to get started? Beth, are you ready to get started?
I am.
Okay, so as I said, good morning, everybody. My name is Amber Clifford Napoleon. I am the director at the McClure Archives and University Museum at the University of Central Missouri in Warrensburg. It's my great pleasure this morning to introduce Beth Ziebarth. Beth Ziebarth has a personal interest and professional responsibility in advocacy for people with disabilities. She currently serves as the director of Access Smithsonian. In her position, Beth develops and implements accessibility policy and guidelines for the institution's 19 museums, the National Zoo, and 9 research centers, ensuring that the Smithsonian's 30 million annual visitors experience welcoming environments that accommodates individuals of all ages and abilities. Her work includes staff training on accessibility and disability topics, facility and program technical assistance, direct accessibility services, outreach and collaboration, and 5 signature programs for people with disabilities. So everyone, please welcome Beth Ziebarth. We would ask that you hold your questions until the end of the session, and then I will be monitoring the questions and fielding them for Beth. So Beth, whenever you're ready, we're ready for you.
Thank you, Amber. So I'll start off with a visual description of myself for the benefit of anybody who has vision loss. I'm disabled, white, 61-year-old woman with shoulder-length blondish hair, glasses, and a steel blue shirt, multicolored glass disc necklace with a blurred background. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, except for, there it is. Okay. Hopefully you all can see that. Okay. So our topic today is Our Future is Inclusive, Museums, Archives, and Disabled People. And we're going to start by just going briefly over Access Smithsonian, my office at the institution, and what we do. Amber hit some of the highlights with my bio, but we currently now have 21 museums, since we have Congress has authorized 2 more museums, the National Museum of the American Latino and the American Women's History Museum. And of course, our numbers of visitors have decreased because of COVID. And we're about 50% of our visitorship at this point. But our office was formed in 1991. It was more coincidence that the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990, and the formation of our office, rather than something that had followed, that we were formed after the passage of the ADA. It was actually an Inspector General audit of the accessibility at the Smithsonian for both staff and visitors that led to a recommendation to establish our office. And for us at the Smithsonian, because we're kind of a quasi-federal agency, we follow both the ADA and Architectural Barriers Act and the Rehab Act. So we are the keepers of the Smithsonian policy on accessibility for visitors and people and staff, all people with disabilities. And we develop practices and procedures for how to implement accessibility at the institution. And we've also developed guidelines to help with the implementation, including the Smithsonian Guidelines for Accessible Exhibition Design, which some of you may be familiar with. And guidelines were written in 1996, but the beginning of the guidelines, have withstood the passage of time, in that is always going to be true. The goals of how we make exhibition content accessible. The tips and tools and techniques may change over time, but those that introduction of the goals is always going to be true. We also do facility and exhibition review to make sure that the facilities in particular comply with the federal standards, and exhibitions too. Oops, skipping ahead there. We provide, I don't know why it's jumping, but provide technical assistance on legal requirements. We do staff and volunteer training, and we also have done training for other organizations in the cultural arts, and we provide visitor access service accommodations like sign language interpreters, real-time captioning, live audio description, etc. And we have 5 signature programs that are pan-institutional, and they include See Me at the Smithsonian, which is a program for individuals who have dementia and their care partners. Morning at the Museum, a program for kids with disabilities and their families. Project Search, an internship program for individuals ages 22 to 30 with developmental and intellectual disabilities. A user expert group of disabled advisors, and the Smithsonian Accessibility Innovations Fund. It's an annual pool of funds that staff can apply to for innovative access solutions, and they can receive up to $50,000. And today, I'd like to talk with you about the basis of our work and provide examples of integrating disability into the design of facilities, exhibitions, programs, and digital experiences. And I'm sure many of you know this, disability is common, and we have 1 billion people on this planet who have a disability, which is 1 in 7 people. That's an older number from 2016. And I think it's a serious undercount. In the United States, 1 in 4 people have a disability. And so it is something that is very common. And it's important to remember that disability intersects with every other identity. And so that makes it even more common in some ways. 20 years ago, I helped produce a conference on disability and the practice of public history. One of the points made by a curator of transportation at the National Museum of American History that has stuck with me and I expanded upon is that there's no human endeavor, whether it is in history, art, culture, or science, that does not include a disability perspective or story. And if you think about that, I think you can really see how there is truth to that. And so it's unfortunate that it's rare to experience disability stories in museums and archives. There are notable exceptions, such as the work at the Missouri History Museum. And a colleague and I recently posted a survey to collect information from disabled people about museums, and every respondent remarked on the lack of accessibility and inclusion. In order to be inclusive, museums and archives must center disability as exhibition and program content with disability representation and perspectives. We advocate for moving from accessibility to inclusion. You have to have both. Accessibility is a foundation. This is a picture of the building site for the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And then a picture of the Smithsonian Castle, built in the 1850s. And accessibility is the foundation, and inclusive design is the goal. What I'd like to do is take you through a definition of inclusive exhibitions and use that as a way for you to think about how this definition can be expanded to facilities or to programs, digital experiences. It's not just not just an exhibition. So an inclusive exhibition, inclusive exhibition is one that's designed to welcome and engage people at the ends of the natural human spectrum of ability, age, and culture, and serves all people within that full range of the spectrum. And the exhibition provides people with integrated equal opportunities to benefit from the content and the presentation. The exhibition has all of its aspects are considered from the initial content development and concept design to fabrication, installation, and maintenance. And inclusion's ingrained into all the design elements that you would think of for an exhibition. Gallery connections to surrounding spaces, physical and emotional layout of spaces, content and communication themes, digital, mechanical interactives, graphics, lighting, sound, the color palette that you choose, furniture and media. You know, one of the things that the father of universal design said is that accessibility, or in this case, inclusive design, is in the details. And it's very true when you're thinking about something like a facility or a exhibition or a program or a digital experience, that it's the details that really make or break whether it's going to be inclusive to somebody with a disability. And it's important to keep in mind that inclusive exhibition meets the federal accessibility standards, whether it's the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act standards, the Architectural Barriers Act standards, if you receive federal funding, state and local requirements for accessibility. All of those minimums are met. And that's an important point to keep in mind, is that what the standards provide is the minimum that you can do in terms of accessibility of a something like an exhibition. And we need to extend that beyond that minimum to design thinking that is really considering the full and equal experience of individuals who have diverse abilities, their diverse ages, mixed age, mixed ability, family and friend groupings, just the range of people who are coming to our institutions. And that allows them the seamless, independent interaction with the environment and with the content. So we can do things that where we are providing more directed experiences, but ideally, and I think this is really true when I look at what we do in the United States versus what people in other countries might do in museums or archives, is really focus on the independent nature of the interaction of the visitor. So ideally, when you build an exhibition, for example, you don't have to have some level of human interaction to to mediate the experience, that you can just walk into the museum and participate in what is on display. But there is usually a range in any museum or archive where you have to have that combination of both um, the designed and built independent interaction, and then the tools that you add that make it possible for people with a variety of disabilities to be able to gain access to the content. So you might provide supplemental programming if needed for additional layers of access and inclusion. We advocate for moving from accessibility to inclusion, as I said, and authentic inclusion means that inclusive exhibitions and programs are designed by and for disabled people with the museum's support and recognition. The very essence of the design comes from the community with the museum's support. And I think this is the part that when you start talking about diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, and you are thinking about equity and stakeholder engagement, that for people with disabilities, we want to be part of the design and provide the input necessary for what you put up in the exhibition or include in a public program, or how we access digital experiences. So it's the next layer up. You start with the accessibility foundation, you go to inclusive design, and then you move to this community development of what we offer. One way that we do that is we work with user experts, and a primary user expert is somebody who has developed by their lived experience, the ability to work with the challenges that an environment will inevitably give them. And so no matter what your disability might be, you have ways that you have figured out to how to work with different environments. And a user expert is not necessarily an expert in accessibility or inclusion, but they do know what works, for themselves based on their life experiences. And that can be very useful in the idea of working on community design of whatever we offer. The user expert group idea came from the Institute for Human-Centered Design in Boston, a frequent partner of ours for our work. And they have a group of about 300 people with disabilities who serve as advisors. And we have a group, small but mighty group of about 40 people thus far. We're recruiting more. People who ideally live locally, although with the pandemic, we've been able to do a lot of remote user expert sessions. And we asked them to participate in prototyping and focus groups and a variety of techniques of gathering feedback. This is an example in this photo of an air and space digital interactive that we're testing with a keypad with a user who uses a scooter, and a staff member is showing how the interactive is supposed to work. And doing this throughout the design process really makes a difference. And I'm going to give you an example of that in a moment. One thing to note with user experts, because we are asking people to share their time and their experience and expertise, we pay them an honorarium. And I think that if you develop a group like this to work with you, to keep that in mind, that this should be a paid experience if possible. And as I said, I'm going to give you a case study from the Molina Family Latino Gallery. Our office and colleagues from the Institute for Human-Centered Design were invited by the director of the Smithsonian Latino Center, Eduardo Diaz, to integrate inclusive design into their new exhibition space, the Molina Family Latino Gallery, which is in the National Museum of American History. And this is a permanent gallery that they will have while the National Museum of the American Latino is being built. And the first exhibition, Presente, a Latino History of the United States, will open in 2022. We're working with the team of architects, exhibition and media designers, and Smithsonian Latino Center staff from concept and construction and beyond to really integrate inclusion of people with disabilities. And I think that the fact that we started off with design charrettes, where we made sure that everybody was together and talked about our intentions with inclusion, has really made a difference. With any exhibition, there are compromises, give and take, and we are trying to make sure that whatever is being presented will be available to people with a variety of disabilities. This photo shows the renderings of the design for the gallery. The center of the gallery will have what's called the foro or plaza, and has 8 like 10-foot tall interactive screens where a visitor can hear stories about the people who are presenting and about Latino history. And you can use that, one of the 8 screens and hear all the different stories. You can move through them. And the way that we made sure that this was accessible for people with various disabilities is through this device, which is a Storm interface audio nav digital keypad, and it helps make touchscreens accessible to visitors with disabilities. The keypad works with a screen reader, which is assistive technology that people who are blind or have low vision use to access things like websites or anything on a computer where the text is made audible. And so they can access the screen reader and get label content and the audio description of what's happening on the screen. And they plug in their headphone into the jack on the keypad and can adjust the volume on the keypad and then move through the content. So that that keypad is something where we're really trying to use this as an opportunity to model the best way to work with touchscreen interactives, since they are inherently inaccessible to people with different types of disabilities. And the National Air and Space Museum, which is currently undergoing a renovation of not only the facility, but all 20 exhibitions are currently being redone. And we're introducing this keypad also to the Air and Space Interactives. So we hope that as time goes on, that we will work out any kinks with this digital keypad, digital interactive keypad, and it becomes a model for the whole of the institution. One of the things that our office really strives to do is have not only integrated experiences, but also consistent experiences for visitors. So it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to teach people how to use this keypad in the American History Museum, and then they go next door to the Natural History Museum. And it's a completely different way to access that, to access a touchscreen. So ideally down the road, we will have this as something that is consistent across the institution. That's always been a struggle. I don't know how many of you, have been to the Smithsonian and seen all the different ways that people come up with to make things accessible, which is great, but it's also somewhat frustrating for a visitor. So I think that will improve things down the road. We the keypad is one example of how to use technology with digital interactives. And a few years ago, I was able to initiate and fund a project on collecting international case studies on best practices for how to make digital interactives accessible. So on the screen is a link to the book the ebook that we produced. It was a collaborative project with the Institute for Human-Centered Design and MW or MuseWeb. And we have about 17 case studies in the ebook, including one on the Olympic and Paralympic Museum, which is a really great example of accessibility. And unfortunately, the Arch Museum was not completed in time for us to ask them for a case study from what they've done. But I saw, my son lives in St. Louis, and we were out there a few months ago, and we went to the Arch Museum. I had heard a lot about it. Friends from the Park Service had worked on it. And I was just blown away with how accessible the Arch exhibition is, particularly for people who are blind or have low vision. I spent over an hour just taking photographs of all the elements that provide accessibility to people, and it was it's now my new favorite example of how to make things really accessible and inclusive for visitors with disabilities. This is an example from what I was talking about earlier about the Smithsonian Accessibility Innovations Fund of projects that we award money to. And our digital program office has been working on, they not only do 3D scans of objects so that they can put 3D representations on websites or use them in interactives in exhibitions, but they've been experimenting with sound frequencies. And this is Abraham Lincoln's face. And what they've done is they've added that sound frequency so that as you move the cursor along, you will get a different frequency based on the, whoops, moving my cursor meant that moved the slide. But it will add to the information that people will get from an audio description of that object. And so hopefully it will add to the overall understanding. I also want to talk a little bit about another project that I have been long interested in, struggled with. Hopefully maybe you have some ideas that you can share with me along this, along the lines of coming up with some solutions. But with our contemporary art museums, like the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, we have seen more and more artwork that is time-based media, and trying to figure out how to provide accessibility for something like that experience when the artist didn't think about it, and may be alive or may not be, and may or may not want to work with us on how we might provide that accessibility, has been kind of an ongoing issue. So probably 10, 15 years ago, first started thinking about art and accessibility more for things like captioning, providing effective communication for people who are deaf or have hearing loss, but also physical access. And this is a photograph from a Yayoi Kusama exhibition, one of her mirror rooms, and the space presents some interesting physical challenges, and that she built a number of these mirror rooms over the course of her career for about, I think, 20 or 30 years. She had different types of mirror rooms, and so the Hirshhorn was going to have on display 4 or 5 of the different mirror rooms, and the dimensions of the doorways and the ways that the physical construction of the space changed over the years. So a couple of the common barriers that we found for physical accessibility was that there was usually a step up into the mirror room. Then there was a runway that was 4 feet wide, that you would use to enter and be in the middle of the room. And you can kind of see that in this photograph. It's kind of the black bar down the middle of the photo. And so we had to try and figure out what the step was easy. We could build a removable ramp to even out the difference between the step and the finished floor. But the runway we couldn't change. At 4 feet wide, somebody who used a wheelchair couldn't turn around on something that was less than 5 feet wide. And so we offered, through visitor services, we kind of thought through what are our options so that people can experience this. And adding the ramp was one thing. We could tell people that they would have the opportunity, if they had an assistive device like a wheelchair, they could enter the room if they felt confident in backing up out of the space. They could look at the room from the doorway, not necessarily the most satisfying way to look at it, but might be necessary. And then another way that we came up with an alternative was through using VR. And so the artist let us use VR for experiencing the room. And so there was a headset that you could put on that would give you kind of a 360 experience of the room. And it was a good start. It was definitely focused on physical access. It didn't include things like the description that would be necessary for people who are blind or have low vision. There's no sound to these pieces, so we didn't have to worry about how it worked for people who were deaf or had hearing loss. But those are the things that we would want to think about as we consider VR, AR as ways to provide alternative experiences for people. And those should be tools, not necessarily the one and only way that people can experience something. I know that over the last few years in particular, there have been a number of notable cases where people with disabilities have really advocated for change in how they experience artwork, where the museum has a sculpture that you're supposed to walk through, for example, at the Tate Modern in London. And it was up several steps, and they talked with the artist, and the artist didn't have an alternative way for people to experience it, and it became a very thorny issue for the museum. The thing that we need to understand in the United States is that the federal accessibility laws require us to provide effective communication. The museums that have these artworks on display, but it doesn't require artists to make things accessible themselves. Ideally, though, if we start really having conversations with artists early on, that there may be ways for us to incorporate that accessibility. And another example from the Hirshhorn is a current exhibition by Laurie Anderson. And it's a whole floor of Laurie Anderson's work, a retrospective, and it includes things like time-based media, different audio pieces, just a wide variety of medium. And she was very open to engaging with the exhibition team from the Hirshhorn on accessibility. There was, like I mentioned before, there are compromises, and there are tools that the museum has developed to work with the exhibition where there are things that are not as accessible to visitors with disabilities as we'd like. And so I think that's, that what we need to move towards is as a group, as in the museum field, that we really think about how we can address these kinds of effective communication issues and with artwork, and develop some guidelines for ourselves on how to do this and how to engage artists, living artists, with coming up with the solutions. So having them part of the discussion too. It has to be people with disabilities, it has to be artists, it has to be museum staff, and all coming together to really think through the solutions. So with that, I'd love to take any questions that you may have. This is a photo of one of our kids who attending Morning at the Museum, a program that was held at the Natural History Museum, and one of our favorites to use for presentations. So let's open it up, Amber, for any questions.
So if you have any questions, just type them in the chat.
Looks like you have people from beyond Missouri. Somebody from Alaska.
From Alaska, yeah. Does anybody have questions about, here we go. Can we talk a little bit more about the VR technology use?
Okay, so VR technology. I think that it really is still, when we did this with the Kusama exhibition, it was really in its infancy in terms of how we could use it within an exhibition. There's been a few exhibitions at the Smithsonian that have used VR, and it's a challenge to do this well. You need to really, ideally you would do something like have a space where people can sit down. We found that one thing that happened is that people get disoriented, or that they need to be able to sit down when they're experiencing VR. And then there's some of the drawbacks, like I talked about, that if you're going to do VR, that we need to really learn from the gaming industry. And there is a lot that has been developed by gamers to make these kinds of experiences more accessible. So adding in captions or adding in description. We were going to do a VR experience with the Laurie Anderson exhibition, and they ended up having to cut that as they were developing the exhibition. It would have been an opportunity for us to experiment more with the audio description in particular. And some of the places that do this and do it well include, not surprisingly, Disney World. They have more money than anybody, and they have really tried to come up with good ways to develop VR experiences. And I think that they probably did learn from the gaming industry. So it's something that needs to be developed further, and as a technology, assistive technology for people with disabilities. So if you ever have examples or know of work that's been done about in this arena. So Amber, it looks
Okay,
like,
we have a body of questions from Bethany, who wants to know about building exhibits for multiple groups, and how do you include all those groups? Do you have representatives from each community? Would you create a work group with representatives from each community and work together to design exhibits? And how do you start those conversations if they have not come into your institution before?
and that's a good, really good inclusive. How do you do stakeholder engagement? Really, and that's it takes a lot of work. There is some guidance through a couple of the centers that are at the Smithsonian, like the Asian Pacific American Center. The director of the center, Lisa Sasaki, came from a community museum and developed materials on how to do that stakeholder engagement, how to build a community. And there are other examples like the Anacostia Community Museum that also do the same thing. For our office and with people with disabilities, it's a combination of utilizing staff experience. So it's not just me, the person as a person with a disability, but staff around the institution who are in different job types and have different lived experiences, who can be part of the advising on exhibitions and on programs, and then going out to the community and recruiting people. So it is oftentimes, it's like who we know personally, what organizations we work with. So it might be, an organization devoted to advocacy for people who are blind, for example, the National Federation of the Blind or the American Council of the Blind, and developing relationships with staff members who can then get us to their members. And they often have local chapters. I know they have local chapters, across the country for those two organizations. And inviting people in and then asking them to again spread the word, and that leads to us recruiting all these people for our user expert group. And then when we're working with a museum or center like the Latino Center, the Molina Family Latino Gallery, we recruited a group of people with different types of disabilities to work on a particular thing. So there are some people within our user expert group who want to stay with a project throughout. And there are some people who will, come in and work on a particular, interactive. So you can do it either way. It's just a matter of whether you have people who can devote the kind of time that it might be necessary for the development of something that is stretched over generally in a pretty long time span, like an exhibition. So if it's going to take 3 years before the exhibition is up, finding people who can and want to stay with a project that's that long, but you can divide it up so that you just recruit people who can talk, give you their reaction to how the audio description is being provided through a piece of technology. So that's kind of our approach with the community side of things, and also working with other organizations that are cultural arts organizations. So there's a lot of shared knowledge with groups like the Leadership Exchange in Arts and Disabilities that the Kennedy Center hosts. They have a listserv. We can all put questions up about the way that we're providing accessibility or inclusion, and get feedback from colleagues about how they do it. And it's just these many layers of ways that you have stakeholder engagement, I guess, if that makes sense.
Okay, we have another question from Dana Roberts, who wants to know, for the museums that struggle with human-centered design, do you have a list of resources to consult? And if so, is this list publicly available?
So I don't have a written list. I have, just, I know some of the organizations that we work with, like the Institute for Human-Centered Design, or United Spinal is another organization that does assessment of facility and exhibition accessibility, and can provide feedback. It's, I think the biggest challenge really is working with architects and exhibition and media designers who don't really have the background on what works and what doesn't for people with disabilities. It's been kind of eye-opening to us in our office, like when we are working with a media designer that says they've done this in the past, and then we find that they really have never really done user experience with people with disabilities. So they may have read about it, or they may have done, they put something into an exhibition without really having the feedback from people with disabilities. And so that's the challenge, is kind of educating as you go along, because you can't really rely on their kind of base knowledge. You do need to have that user experience of what works, what doesn't. So I wish I could give you more, like names of organizations or firms that do this well. I think that the Arch example is a good one, where you could potentially look at who worked with the Arch on the accessibility there. I know it was partly Park Service staff who have deep accessibility knowledge, but it's also a community organization that worked with them, and then they hired a really good design firm that produced the things like the tactile experiences. So they had a lot of experience in doing that particular aspect of the exhibition. You can always contact me, if you have questions about like who to go to, and I'd be happy to work with you through email.
Well, I have a question for you, Beth, and the truth is, a lot of us in Missouri run on a shoestring budget. We don't have budgets for a whole lot. So if we were running on a shoestring budget for an exhibition plan, what's the one thing that you would recommend we make sure to include to make the exhibition more accessible?
That's a really good question, Amber. And I would say if you were to get together, small group of people with disabilities, pose the question to them and say, here's what our main theme is of the exhibition, and here are the exhibition components that we're considering, and what would you advise that we do to make these things accessible? And so it may be that they say you should have a tactile of this particular skeleton of a particular animal, because it's something that we have no experience with, and we need to better understand that through tactile experience. Or it might be, adding some things that don't cost a lot of money, like captions are now you can do them yourself, or you can do them pretty inexpensively through different companies that are providing that kind of service. So it's not always expensive. It's mainly more that you need to find out what are the barriers, identify those barriers, and then come up with some kind of community solutions to the barrier. Yeah, I think it's really important to understand that. Yeah, I know I'm coming from the Smithsonian, and it probably seems like we have more money than anybody, but truth be told, we're always fighting for accessibility money and budgets, and any size organization can follow some of the same steps that we do, and help decide what's going to work best at a cost that you can afford.
Okay. And I've got one other question, since we don't have questions hanging on waiting. What is the Smithsonian doing in terms of accessibility and inclusion for example, people on the autism spectrum who may be affected by lights and sounds, or people who are living with mental health conditions that may not be visible to you?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that it is something that really needs to impact design more. So right now, we're doing things that we consider tools, things that meet people where they're at, like the Morning at the Museum program for kids with different kinds of disabilities. It started out primarily focused on kids who are autistic, but then grew to kids with really any brain-based disability or physical disability. And the point of it is that we try and take away some of the things that are disruptive to a visit to the museum. So it's taking away the crowds, and that it's early opening hours that we do the program, so you don't have the crowds, and you also can do things like turn off some of the lights or the sounds with exhibition components that are competing with one another in a space. But it's also kind of giving people or families practice with visiting museums. A lot of families told us that the reason they wanted to participate in Morning at the Museum is because they felt when they went to museums and other public spaces that they spent a lot of time being judged by other people about how they were interacting with their kids, how the kids behaved, and they just wanted to be with other people who would be understanding and not, judge them. So that was another added benefit of doing the program. But ultimately, we want the families to learn how to come to the museum anytime, not just when we have morning at the museum, and that the kids will become, lifelong museum goers. So we are seeing that the program's been going on for over 10 years, and now these kids are, teenagers or young adults, and they want to intern at the museum, or they want to get a job at the museum, and that's exactly what we want to see. They also want programs that are appropriate for adults, and that's something we need to really work on, is the way that we design programs, that they do provide the kinds of tools that are necessary or expected by people with different brain-based disabilities. And then the other piece to it is that if you're thinking about a physical environment, that you can do things like quiet rooms where people can kind of decompress if necessary. Design things so that it works well for somebody who has PTSD, for example, where you don't have a space that has only one door into it, so that people feel safe to be able to go into the space. It's training of staff, everybody from the security officers who are encountering service dogs and need to know how to interact with somebody who has a service dog because they have PTSD, for example. So all of those things kind of go together to make the experience better, more inclusive of people who are autistic or have other brain-based disabilities.
Okay, does anybody else have any other questions for Beth? Well, Beth, if you want to take a minute and share your email address with everybody so that if they have questions or follow-up comments, they can reach you later.
I will. Hold on, let me get to everyone here. There you go. So I welcome your
Perfect.
emails, your questions. Yes, and thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you very much for joining us. It's been a great session and we appreciate you taking the time.
Yes. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
All right, thank you everybody for attending, and see you at the next session.